The desert wind carries secrets across the endless expanse of Nevada highway, where the asphalt shimmers like a mirage in the relentless August heat. It's here, along this forgotten stretch of Route 50, dubbed the loneliest road in America, that time seems to move differently, where the past and present blur together like heat waves rising from sun-baked concrete. In 1981, this desolate corridor would become the backdrop for a mystery so profound, so utterly inexplicable, that it would haunt investigators for more than 4 decades. The Sunset Vista Motel sits like a relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering weakly against the vast Nevada sky. Built in 1954 to serve travelers on their way to California's promised land, the motel had seen better days by the summer of its 24 rooms, stretched in a horseshoe shape around a kidney-shaped pool that hadn't held clean water in years. The paint peeled from wooden doors like dried skin, and the desert had begun to reclaim the parking lot, weeds pushing through cracks in the asphalt with determined persistence. It was here, on the night of August 15, 1981, that David and Linda Hartwell checked into rooms. They were an ordinary couple from Sacramento, California. He, a 34-year-old insurance adjuster with kind eyes and a receding hairline. She, a 31-year-old elementary school teacher with auburn hair and a laugh that could light up a room. They had been married for 8 years, and this trip to Lake Tahoe was meant to be their second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after months of trying to conceive their first child. The desk clerk that night was Wayne Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s who had worked at the Sunset Vista for nearly a decade. Morrison would later tell investigators that the Hartwells seemed like any other couple passing through, tired from the road, eager to rest before continuing their journey. David had paid for one night in cash, crisp $20 bills that Morrison had carefully placed in the register. Linda had asked about local restaurants, and Morrison had recommended the diner 2 miles down the road, warning them it closed at 10. They seemed happy, Morrison would recall years later, his voice heavy with the weight of what came next. Real happy, like they were looking forward to something. The couple had arrived in a 1978 maroon Chevrolet Malibu, license plate 847JXR, which David had parked directly in front of their room. Their luggage was minimal: 2 small suitcases and a camera bag that Linda carried carefully, as if it contained precious cargo. They had disappeared into room 17 around 7:30 p.m., the last time anyone would see them alive. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning, when the housekeeping staff arrived. Maria Gonzalez, a 23-year-old mother of 2 who had been cleaning rooms at the motel for 3 years, knocked on the door of room 17 at precisely 11 a.m. checkout time. When no one answered, she tried again, calling out in both English and Spanish. The silence that greeted her was complete, unnatural in a way that made her skin crawl. Morrison gave her the master key, assuming the guests had simply overslept. But when Maria turned the key and pushed open the door, she stepped into a scene that would be burned into her memory forever. The room was pristine, as if no one had ever stayed there. The beds were still made with military precision, their covers pulled tight and tucked beneath the mattresses. Towels hung unused in the bathroom. The carpet showed no sign of footprints or disturbance. Most disturbing of all was what wasn't there. The Hartwells' luggage was gone. Their car was gone, but their room key lay on the nightstand, along with something that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. Linda's wedding ring, positioned carefully beside the key as if it had been placed there with deliberate intent. Morrison called the Churchill County Sheriff's Department at 11:47 a.m. Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at the motel within 20 minutes, his patrol car kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled into the parking lot. Bradley was a 15-year veteran of rural law enforcement, a man who had seen his share of strange occurrences in the Nevada desert. But even he was unprepared for the scene that awaited him in room. The initial investigation was thorough, but yielded more questions than answers. Bradley dusted for fingerprints and found only partial prints from the housekeeping staff and the desk clerk. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that anyone had actually spent the night in the room. The bed sheets were cold to the touch, as if they had never been slept in. The bathroom told the same story. Soap bars remained in their paper wrappers. Glasses sat unused on the sink counter. The shower was bone dry, without even a trace of humidity that would suggest recent use. It was as if the Hartwells had checked in, received their key, and then simply vanished into the desert air. Bradley expanded his search to the surrounding area, walking the perimeter of the motel with methodical precision. Behind the building, he discovered something that would become a crucial piece of the puzzle. Tire tracks in the soft sand, leading away from the motel toward a dirt road that snaked into the hills. The tracks were deep and fresh, suggesting a heavy vehicle or one carrying significant weight. But by the time Bradley returned with casting equipment the next day, the desert wind had erased them completely. The missing persons report was filed on August 17th, 2 days after the Hartwells had vanished. Detective Ray Coleman of the Churchill County Sheriff's Department took the lead on the case, bringing with him 22 years of experience and a reputation for never giving up on a case. Coleman was a tall, lean man with penetrating blue eyes and a methodical approach to investigation that had solved dozens of missing persons cases throughout rural Nevada. Coleman's first step was to trace the Hartwells' movements leading up to their arrival at the Sunset Vista. Phone records showed they had made several calls from Sacramento in the days before their departure, including reservations at a Lake Tahoe resort and dinner plans with friends they would never keep. Their bank account showed a withdrawal of $800 in cash on August 13th, an unusually large amount that suggested they were prepared for an extended trip. Interviews with friends and family painted a picture of a stable, loving couple with no known enemies or financial troubles. David's supervisor at the insurance company described him as reliable and honest, a man who had never missed a day of work in 6 years. Linda's principal at Jefferson Elementary spoke of a dedicated teacher who was beloved by her students and colleagues alike. There were no hints of marital discord, no secret affairs, no hidden debts or dangerous associations. The Chevrolet Malibu proved to be another dead end. Despite an extensive search that covered 3 states, the vehicle was never found. The license plate number was entered into the National Crime Information Center database, and bulletins were sent to law enforcement agencies across the West. But it was as if the car, like its occupants, had simply ceased to exist. As days turned into weeks, the investigation took on an increasingly desperate tone. Coleman brought in cadaver dogs to search the desert around the motel, but they found nothing. He enlisted the help of the Nevada Highway Patrol to set up roadblocks and question travelers, but no one remembered seeing the Hartwells or their vehicle. Even the FBI became involved, given the possibility that the couple had been taken across state lines. Special Agent Catherine Murphy arrived from the Las Vegas field office on August 28th, bringing with her the resources of the federal government and a reputation for solving the unsolvable. Murphy was a 20-year veteran of the Bureau, a specialist in missing persons cases who had worked some of the most notorious kidnapping cases in the Southwest. Her arrival signaled that the Hartwell disappearance was being taken seriously at the highest levels of law enforcement. Murphy's investigation was exhaustive and methodical. She interviewed every guest who had stayed at the Sunset Vista in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, looking for patterns or connections. She examined financial records, phone logs, and travel itineraries with microscopic precision. She even had the room itself examined by FBI forensic specialists, who used luminol and other advanced techniques to search for trace evidence of violence. But the room yielded no secrets. If anything, the forensic examination only deepened the mystery. The specialists found that the room had been cleaned with an unusual thoroughness that went far beyond normal housekeeping procedures. Traces of industrial-grade cleaning solvents were detected on surfaces throughout the room, suggesting someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to eliminate all evidence of the Hartwells' presence. More puzzling still was the discovery of microscopic fibers embedded in the carpet fibers that didn't match anything the Hartwells had been wearing or carrying. Laboratory analysis revealed the fibers to be from a rare type of industrial rope, the kind used in commercial shipping or construction. But there was no obvious source for such material at the motel, and no explanation for how it had gotten into rooms. The wedding ring became another focal point of the investigation. Linda's sister confirmed it was indeed Linda's ring, a simple gold band with an inscription inside that read, "Forever DNL 8/12/73, the date of their wedding. But why would Linda remove her ring? And why would she leave it behind? The positioning of the ring on the nightstand suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not dropped or forgotten in haste. Psychological profilers brought in by the FBI suggested several theories. Perhaps the Hartwells had staged their own disappearance, starting new lives under assumed identities. But this theory was quickly dismissed when their bank accounts remained untouched, and their social security numbers were never used again. Another theory suggested they had encountered foul play from unknown assailants, but the complete lack of evidence made this scenario equally unlikely. As autumn arrived in the Nevada desert, the investigation began to lose momentum. Despite thousands of hours of police work and the involvement of multiple agencies, investigators had found virtually no concrete evidence to explain what had happened to David and Linda Hartwell. The case remained open, but active leads had dried up and other urgent matters demanded attention. The families of the missing couple refused to give up hope. David's brother Michael hired a private investigator, a former Los Angeles police detective named Frank Torres, who specialized in cold cases. Torres spent months retracing the FBI's steps, interviewing witnesses, and exploring theories that law enforcement had dismissed. But even his considerable skills and resources couldn't crack the mystery of Room. Local newspapers picked up the story, and for a brief time, the Hartwell disappearance became a regional sensation. The Sacramento Bee ran a series of articles about the missing couple, complete with photographs and appeals for information. Tips poured in from across the country: sightings in bus stations, glimpses in shopping malls, encounters in remote diners. But every lead turned out to be a dead end, another cruel reminder of how thoroughly the Hartwells had vanished. As 1981 drew to a close, the Sunset Vista Motel found itself with an unwanted reputation. Room 17 became impossible to book, as word of the disappearance spread through the tight-knit community of long-distance travelers. Ghost stories began to circulate, tales of strange sounds in the night, glimpses of figures that vanished when approached, cold spots that couldn't be explained by the desert's dramatic temperature swings. The motel's owner, Harold Delaney, tried to capitalize on the notoriety by marketing Room 17 as a mystery suite, complete with newspaper clippings and FBI reports displayed in a glass case. But the novelty wore off quickly, and most guests found the room's history more disturbing than intriguing. Within 6 months, Delaney had given up on the gimmick and simply removed Room 17 from the available inventory. Detective Coleman never stopped thinking about the case, even as other investigations demanded his attention. He kept a file on his desk labeled Hartwell DNL that grew thicker with each passing month as new theories and potential connections were explored and discarded. The case became an obsession for him, a puzzle that seemed to mock his 22 years of investigative experience. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the desert wind rattled the windows of his office, Coleman would spread the case files across his desk and study them like a scholar examining ancient texts. The photographs of Room 17, the forensic reports, the witness statements, all of it told the same impossible story. 2 people had checked into a motel room and then disappeared so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. Years passed. The investigation officially moved to cold case status in 1984, though Coleman continued to work it whenever time permitted. New technologies emerged: DNA analysis, computer databases, advanced forensic techniques, and each one offered hope that the mystery might finally be solved. But the Hartwell case seemed immune to technological advancement, as inexplicable in the digital age as it had been in. The families aged and moved on. though they never stopped hoping for answers. Michael Hartwell published a book about his brother's disappearance in 1989, titled Vanished: The Search for David and Linda. The book generated renewed interest in the case and prompted several television documentaries, but no new evidence emerged. Linda's sister died in 1995, taking with her the hope that she might one day see her sister again. Detective Coleman retired in 1998, but couldn't let go of the case that had defined the final decades of his career. He kept copies of all the files in his home office, and his former colleagues would occasionally find him at the Sunset Vista Motel, standing in front of the boarded-up entrance to room 17, lost in thought. The motel itself changed hands several times over the years, each new owner struggling with the building's dark history. It was renovated in 2003, demolished and rebuilt in 2011, and finally abandoned altogether in 2019, when interstate highway improvements redirected traffic away from the old route. But even as the physical structure crumbled, the mystery of room 17 endured. It was in the summer of 2024, 43 years after the Hartwells' disappearance, that construction workers breaking ground for a new solar farm made a discovery that would finally shed light on one of Nevada's most enduring mysteries. The find came purely by accident. A bulldozer operator noticed something unusual in the desert sand about 2 miles from where the Sunset Vista Motel once stood. What they found buried beneath 4 decades of accumulated sand and debris would send shockwaves through the law enforcement community and reopen a case that many had assumed would never be solved. The discovery was so significant, so potentially game-changing, that the FBI immediately dispatched a full forensic team to the site. The team was led by Special Agent Sarah Chen, a specialist in cold case investigations, who had studied the Hartwell disappearance as part of her training at Quantico. Chen arrived at the excavation site on a blazing July morning, armed with the latest forensic technology and a determination to finally answer the questions that had haunted investigators for nearly half a century. What Chen and her team found in that Nevada desert would prove that the Hartwell case was far more complex and sinister than anyone had ever imagined. The evidence buried beneath the sand would reveal a truth so disturbing that it would force investigators to completely reconsider everything they thought they knew about that August night in night. But that discovery, and the dark secrets it would unveil, would have to wait for the next chapter of this extraordinary story, a chapter that would prove that some mysteries are worth waiting decades to solve, and that the truth, when it finally emerges, can be more terrifying than any fiction ever conceived. The desert keeps its secrets well, but it doesn't keep them forever. The excavation site stretched across the Nevada desert like an open wound, its machinery casting long shadows in the harsh morning sun. Special Agent Rebecca Walsh stood at the edge of the dig, her weathered boots planted firmly in the sand that had kept its secrets for more than 4 decades. At 42, Walsh had built her reputation on breathing life back into cold cases that others had given up for dead. The Hartwell disappearance had been her white whale since joining the Bureau's cold case unit 5 years earlier. The construction foreman, a sun-weathered man named Bill Garrett, pointed toward a section of disturbed earth where his bulldozer had made the discovery. "We were clearing for the solar panel foundations when the blade caught something," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "At first, we thought it was just old construction debris, maybe from when they built the highway back in the 50s. But it wasn't construction debris. What Garrett's bulldozer had unearthed was far more sinister and far more significant to the Hartwell investigation than anyone could have initially imagined. The first item to emerge from the Nevada sand was a piece of corroded metal, roughly rectangular and bearing traces of what appeared to be paint. The FBI's forensic team worked with archaeological precision, carefully brushing away decades of accumulated desert sediment to reveal the object in its entirety. As the sand fell away, the shape became unmistakable, a license plate, its numbers barely visible beneath layers of rust and corrosion. Walsh felt her pulse quicken as the forensic photographer documented the plate from every angle. Even before the lab could confirm it, she could make out enough of the registration to know they had found something extraordinary. The partial numbers visible through the corrosion matched the license plate of the 1978 Chevrolet Malibu that David and Linda Hartwell had been driving when they disappeared. But the license plate was only the beginning. As the excavation continued throughout the sweltering afternoon, more items emerged from the sand like artifacts from a buried civilization. Personal effects that had been carefully catalogued in the original missing persons report began to surface. A leather wallet containing David's driver's license and credit cards. The leather cracked and faded, but the contents still recognizable. Linda's purse, its contents scattered but identifiable, including a tube of lipstick in a shade called Desert Rose that her sister had mentioned in her 19. The excavation team worked in expanding grids, each section meticulously mapped and photographed before any artifact was removed. The Nevada heat was relentless, with temperatures soaring past 110 degrees, but Walsh refused to leave the site. She had waited too long for a break in this case to let anything slip through the cracks. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the excavation revealed something that made Walsh's blood run cold. Buried deeper than the personal effects, wrapped in what appeared to be industrial plastic sheeting, were human remains. The skeleton was intact, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberately arranged pose, arms crossed over the chest in a manner that suggested ritualistic placement rather than hasty burial. Dr. Amanda Foster, the FBI's chief forensic anthropologist, arrived on scene within hours of the discovery. Foster was a legend in her field, a woman who could read stories in bones that others couldn't even see. She approached the remains with the reverence of someone who understood that she was looking at more than just evidence. She was looking at someone's loved one, someone who had been mourning their loss for 43 years. The positioning is definitely intentional, Foster observed as she conducted her preliminary examination. This wasn't a body dump or a hasty burial. Someone took time and care with this placement. She pointed to the crossed arms, the straight alignment of the legs, the careful positioning of the skull. This suggests either respect for the deceased or some kind of ritualistic significance. But as Foster continued her examination, she made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation. The remains showed clear evidence of trauma, multiple fractures to the skull and ribs that were consistent with blunt force violence. More disturbing still, the bones showed signs of having been deliberately cleaned before burial, stripped of all soft tissue with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge. This wasn't a crime of passion, Foster concluded as she carefully extracted the remains for transport to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico. This was methodical, planned, executed with surgical precision. Whoever did this had experience with human anatomy and access to specialized tools. The second skeleton was discovered the following morning, buried adjacent to the first in an identical pose and wrapping. The forensic evidence told the same story: deliberate trauma, careful cleaning, ritualistic positioning. The killer, it seemed, had a very specific methodology, a signature that spoke to deep psychological motivations that went far beyond simple murder. DNA analysis would take weeks to complete, but Walsh was already convinced they had found David and Linda Hartwell. The location, the timing, the personal effects, everything pointed to these being the remains of the couple who had vanished from room 17 43 years earlier. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who had killed them? How had they gotten the couple from the motel to this remote location? And why had they gone to such elaborate lengths to prepare and bury the bodies? The excavation continued for another 3 days, with the FBI team expanding their search in ever-widening circles around the burial site. What they found painted a picture of a crime that was far more complex than a simple murder. Buried near the bodies were items that had never been mentioned in the original investigation. Professional-grade rope that matched the microscopic fibers found in room 17, surgical instruments that appeared to be from the 1970s or early 1980s, and most disturbing of all, photographs. The photographs were in remarkable condition, protected by waterproof containers that had kept them intact through 4 decades of desert weather. They showed the interior of what appeared to be a medical facility or laboratory, complete with examination tables, surgical lighting, and walls lined with anatomical charts. But these weren't ordinary medical photographs. The images showed human subjects in various stages of what could only be described as experimentation procedures that no legitimate medical facility would ever conduct. Walsh studied the photographs with growing horror, recognizing that they had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple missing persons case. The images suggested the existence of an organized operation, possibly involving multiple perpetrators and spanning an unknown period of time. The Hartwells, it appeared, had been victims of something that resembled the darkest chapters of human experimentation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to profile the killer or killers based on the evidence recovered from the burial site. The analysis, led by Supervisory Special Agent Dr. Michael Reeves, painted a chilling picture of the perpetrator's psychology. The careful preparation of the bodies, the ritualistic burial, the photographic documentation all pointed to someone with a God complex, someone who viewed their victims not as human beings but as specimens for study. This individual likely has extensive medical or scientific training, Reeves concluded in his preliminary profile. The precision of the bone cleaning, the surgical nature of the trauma, the careful documentation through photography, this all suggests someone operating under the delusion that they are conducting legitimate research. They may have convinced themselves that their actions serve some greater scientific purpose. The profile went on to describe someone who was likely highly intelligent, socially integrated, and capable of maintaining a normal facade while conducting horrific acts in private. This wasn't a disorganized killer operating on impulse. This was someone who had developed a systematic approach to murder that they had likely refined over multiple victims. This realization led Walsh to expand her investigation beyond the Hartwell case. If the killer had been operating in 1981 with such precision and methodology, it was highly unlikely that the Hartwells were their first victims. A search of missing persons databases from the 1970s and 1980s began to reveal a disturbing pattern. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, couples traveling through remote areas of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona had been disappearing under circumstances that bore striking similarities to the Hartwell case. In 1978, newlyweds James and Patricia Morrison had vanished from a roadside motel in rural Utah, leaving behind only their luggage and Patricia's jewelry. In 1979, Robert and Helen Carver had disappeared from their campsite in northern Arizona, their RV found empty but undisturbed. In 1983, Anthony and Mary Delacroix had checked into a motel in eastern Nevada and were never seen again. Each case had been investigated separately by local law enforcement, with no agency recognizing the potential connections between the disappearances. The vast distances involved, the jurisdictional boundaries, and the limited communication technology of the era had prevented investigators from seeing the larger pattern. But now, with the benefit of modern databases and communication systems, the connections were becoming impossible to ignore. Walsh began reaching out to the agencies that had handled these cold cases, requesting files and evidence that had been gathering dust in storage rooms across the Southwest. What she found confirmed her worst fears. They were dealing with a serial killer who had been operating for years, possibly decades, targeting couples who were traveling through remote areas with little chance of immediate discovery. The killer's methodology was consistent across all the cases. Couples would check into isolated motels or campgrounds, then vanish without a trace, leaving behind personal effects arranged in ways that suggested deliberate staging. In every case, the disappearances occurred in areas where burial sites could remain undiscovered for decades, hidden in the vast expanses of the American West. But the Hartwell case was different in one crucial respect. They had found the bodies, For the first time in what appeared to be a decades-long killing spree, investigators had physical evidence of the killer's work. The burial site, the forensic evidence, the photographs, all of it provided unprecedented insight into the mind and methods of someone who had managed to kill with impunity for years. The breakthrough came when Dr. Foster completed her analysis of the skeletal remains, hidden within the bones themselves. Protected by the arid Nevada climate were microscopic traces of unusual chemical compounds. Spectrographic analysis revealed the presence of industrial preservatives and embalming fluids, but in combinations that didn't match standard mortuary practices. Instead, the chemical signatures suggested someone with access to a sophisticated laboratory, someone who had been experimenting with different preservation techniques. More significantly, isotope analysis of the bones revealed that the Hartwells had been held captive for an extended period before their deaths. The chemical markers in their bone tissue showed a pattern of stress and malnutrition consistent with prolonged captivity, suggesting they had been alive for weeks or possibly months after their disappearance from the motel. This revelation fundamentally changed the timeline of the case. The Hartwells hadn't been killed immediately after leaving room 17. They had been taken somewhere, held prisoner, and subjected to unknown horrors before finally being murdered and buried in the desert. The realization added new urgency to the investigation, as it suggested the killer had maintained some kind of facility where victims could be held for extended periods. Walsh ordered aerial surveys of the desert around the burial site, looking for any structures that might have served as a holding facility. The surveys revealed several abandoned buildings within a 50-mile radius, including an old mining operation that had been shuttered in the 1970s, and a defunct research station that had once been operated by a now-defunct pharmaceutical company. The research station proved to be the most intriguing lead. Built in 1962 by Meridian Pharmaceuticals to conduct desert ecology research, the facility had been abandoned in 1975 when the company went bankrupt. Located 40 miles from the burial site, the station consisted of several concrete buildings designed to withstand the harsh desert environment. More importantly, the facility had been equipped with laboratory spaces, medical equipment, and holding areas for research animals. A search of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' employment records revealed dozens of employees who had worked at the research station during its operational years. Most were legitimate researchers and support staff, but one name stood out: Vincent Marlowe, a biochemist who had been hired in 1973 and had remained at the facility until its closure. Marlowe's employment file contained several disturbing notes about inappropriate conduct and questionable research methods, but he had never been formally disciplined due to his brilliant work in chemical preservation techniques. After the research station closed, Marlowe had simply vanished. His employment records showed no forwarding address, no subsequent job applications, no trace of where he might have gone. It was as if he had disappeared into the desert, taking his knowledge and his secrets with him. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. As Walsh's team combed through the abandoned research station, they found evidence that someone had continued to use the facility long after its official closure. Hidden rooms had been carved out of the desert rock beneath the main buildings, creating a subterranean complex that was invisible from the surface. These rooms contained the remnants of a sophisticated laboratory, complete with examination tables, surgical equipment, and walls lined with jars containing preserved biological specimens. The jars were labeled with dates ranging from 1976 to 1987, a timeline that perfectly encompassed the disappearances Walsh had been investigating. But the specimens weren't animal tissue as one might expect from a legitimate research facility. They were human organs, tissue samples, and other biological materials that had been preserved with the same chemical compounds found in the Hartwell remains. The underground laboratory was a chamber of horrors that defied comprehension. Photographs mounted on the walls showed the progression of various experiments conducted on unwilling human subjects. Detailed notes, written in a precise hand, documented procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The killer hadn't just been murdering couples, he had been using them as test subjects in a twisted research program that he had convinced himself was legitimate science. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery in the underground laboratory was a collection of personal items that had belonged to the missing couples. Wedding rings, watches, jewelry, photographs, all carefully catalogued and preserved like trophies. Among these items, Walsh found Linda Hartwell's engagement ring, the one that had been missing from room 17 along with the couple themselves. The ring was displayed in a place of honor, mounted in a glass case alongside a photograph of Linda taken at some point during her captivity. The image showed her alive but clearly terrified, her eyes wide with fear as she stared directly into the camera. It was the first proof that the Hartwells had survived their initial abduction, and the first glimpse into the nightmare they had endured before their deaths. As Walsh stood in that underground chamber, surrounded by the evidence of decades of systematic murder and torture, she realized that the Hartwell case was just the tip of an iceberg. The killer had operated with impunity for more than a decade, perfecting his methods and expanding his operation under the cover of legitimate scientific research. He had chosen his victims carefully, couples traveling through remote areas where their disappearances might not be immediately noticed, people who could vanish without raising immediate alarm. But the operation had ended abruptly in 1987, with no explanation for why the killer had stopped or where he had gone. The laboratory showed signs of hasty abandonment, with equipment left running and experiments left incomplete. Something had forced him to flee, to abandon his carefully constructed lair and disappear into the vastness of the American West. The question that haunted Walsh as she surveyed the scene was whether the killer was still alive. If Dr. Vincent Marlowe was indeed their suspect, he would be in his 80s by now, old, but not necessarily incapacitated. And if he was still alive, if he was still out there somewhere, then 43 years of silence might be about to come to an end. The answer to that question would come sooner than Walsh could have imagined, in a way that would prove that some nightmares never truly end. They just wait in the darkness for the right moment to emerge once again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert as Special Agent Rebecca Walsh stood at the entrance to Dr. Vincent Marlowe's abandoned laboratory, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. 3 months had passed since the discovery of the underground chamber, and the investigation had taken on the urgency of a manhunt. The FBI's most wanted list now included a photograph of Marlowe from 1975, a thin man with piercing dark eyes and prematurely gray hair, someone who could blend into any crowd of academic professionals. But finding a man who had vanished 40 years ago was proving to be more challenging than Walsh had anticipated. Marlowe had been methodical in covering his tracks, leaving behind a trail that seemed to evaporate like morning mist in the desert heat. Bank records, Social Security usage, credit reports all showed no activity after 1987. It was as if Vincent Marlowe had simply ceased to exist on paper, becoming a ghost haunting the margins of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, a forensic psychiatrist consulting on the case, had been studying the detailed notes found in Marlowe's laboratory when she noticed something that had been overlooked by the investigative team. Hidden among the clinical observations and experimental procedures were references to a Phase 3 of Marlowe's research, mentions of a secondary facility where he planned to expand his operations. He wasn't working alone, Dr. Chen explained to Walsh during a briefing at the FBI's Las Vegas field office. The scope of this operation, the sophistication of the procedures, the sheer volume of documentation this required resources and assistance that one person couldn't have provided. Marlowe had partners, financial backers, maybe even a network of like-minded individuals. This revelation sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. Walsh began combing through Meridian Pharmaceuticals' corporate records, looking for connections between Marlowe and other employees who might have shared his twisted interests. What she found was a web of relationships that extended far beyond the defunct research station, reaching into universities, private medical practices, and even government contractors. Among Marlowe's closest associates was Dr. Raymond Hutchins, a former military physician who had been conducting classified research for the Department of Defense before joining Meridian. Hutchins had specialized in what he euphemistically called extreme stress response studies, research that walked the thin line between legitimate medical investigation and human experimentation. His military records, obtained through classified channels, revealed a pattern of ethical violations that had been quietly covered up to protect national security interests. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Hutchins had maintained contact with Marlowe after the closure of the research station. Financial records showed regular payments from Hutchins to a series of shell companies that had been traced back to properties in remote areas of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. The payments had continued until 1987, when they stopped abruptly the same year that Marlowe's laboratory had been abandoned. The investigation led Walsh to a remote compound in the mountains of northern Montana, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest for 15 miles. The property had been purchased in 1976 by one of Hutchins' shell companies and had been developed as what appeared to be a private medical research facility. Satellite imagery showed several buildings connected by underground tunnels, along with what appeared to be housing units and a sophisticated communications array. But when Walsh's team arrived at the Montana compound in late November, they found it as abandoned as the Nevada laboratory. The buildings were empty, stripped of equipment and documentation. However, unlike the hasty abandonment of the desert facility, this site showed signs of deliberate decommissioning. Equipment had been carefully removed, files had been systematically destroyed, and even the underground tunnels had been sealed with concrete. The only clue to what had happened came from local residents in the nearest town, nearly 30 miles away. Several people remembered a period in the late 1980s when there had been unusual activity at the remote facility, helicopters coming and going at all hours, trucks carrying what appeared to be medical equipment, and strangers asking questions about local missing persons reports. Then, sometime in early 1987, the activity had stopped completely, and the facility had been abandoned. The timing coincided perfectly with a series of events that would explain why Marlowe and his associates had been forced to shut down their operation. In 1986, congressional hearings had begun investigating unethical medical experiments conducted by government agencies and private contractors. The hearings, sparked by revelations about MKUltra and other classified programs, had created a climate of scrutiny that would have made continued operation impossible for anyone conducting illegal human experimentation. More specifically, Walsh discovered that Dr. Raymond Hutchins had been scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee in March 1987 about his military research. The hearing never took place because Hutchins had died in an apparent car accident 2 weeks before his scheduled testimony. The timing was suspicious, but the local investigation had concluded that icy road conditions had caused Hutchins to lose control of his vehicle on a mountain curve. With Hutchins dead and congressional investigators closing in, Marlowe would have had no choice but to abandon his operation and disappear. But where had he gone? And was he still alive 37 years later? The answer came from an unlikely source. While reviewing cold case files from the late 1980s, Walsh discovered a series of suspicious deaths in nursing homes across the Pacific Northwest. Between 1988 and 1995, 7 elderly patients had died under circumstances that medical examiners had found unusual but not necessarily criminal. The deaths had occurred at different facilities, with no apparent connection between the victims or the institutions. But when Walsh examined the medical records more closely, she found a disturbing pattern. All 7 victims had died while under the care of a physician named Dr. Vincent Mitchell, a geriatrician who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere in 1988 and had worked at various medical facilities throughout Oregon and Washington. Mitchell's credentials were impeccable: medical degree from Johns Hopkins, residency at Mayo Clinic, fellowship in geriatric medicine at UCLA. But when Walsh attempted to verify these credentials, she discovered they were completely fabricated. More telling still were the circumstances of the deaths. Each victim had been elderly and isolated, with no family members to ask questions about their medical care. The deaths had been attributed to natural causes, but the medical records showed unusual procedures and medications that were inconsistent with standard geriatric care. It appeared that Dr. Mitchell had been continuing his experiments, using vulnerable elderly patients as test subjects for his research. The trail of Dr. Vincent Mitchell led Walsh to a retirement community in rural Oregon called Sunset Manor, where he had worked from 1990. The facility's administrator, Janet Coleman, remembered Mitchell clearly a quiet, intense man who had kept to himself, but had been extraordinarily dedicated to his patients. He would spend hours with them, Coleman recalled. He said he was working on revolutionary treatments for age-related decline. At the time, we thought he was just very committed to his work. But residents and staff had begun to notice disturbing changes in the patients under Mitchell's care. Several had experienced rapid cognitive decline. Others had developed unusual symptoms that didn't match any known medical conditions. When family members of one patient had demanded an independent medical evaluation, they had discovered evidence of unauthorized procedures and experimental medications. Mitchell had disappeared that same night, leaving behind only a resignation letter and his fabricated credentials. Local police had investigated Mitchell's disappearance but had found no trace of where he had gone. His apartment had been completely cleaned out, with no personal belongings or documents left behind. Even his medical license had been issued under false pretenses, making it impossible to track him through professional channels. The investigation seemed to have reached another dead end when Walsh received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as Thomas Marlowe, claiming to be Vincent Marlowe's nephew. He had read about the FBI investigation in newspaper reports and had information that might be relevant to the case. Thomas Marlowe was a 68-year-old retired accountant living in Phoenix, Arizona. He had grown up hearing family stories about his uncle Vincent, the brilliant scientist who had disappeared in the night. What Thomas revealed during his interview with Walsh provided crucial insight into Marlowe's psychology and motivations. Uncle Vincent was always obsessed with death, Thomas explained. Even as a child, he would collect dead animals and perform what he called experiments on them. Our family thought he would become a legitimate doctor or researcher, someone who could channel that fascination into something positive. But there was always something wrong about him, something that made people uncomfortable. Thomas went on to describe how Vincent had become increasingly isolated after completing his education, cutting off contact with most family members and becoming secretive about his work. The last time Thomas had seen his uncle was at a family gathering in 1975, where Vincent had spoken enthusiastically about his research at the Meridian facility. He talked about unlocking the secrets of human biology, about conducting research that would revolutionize medicine, Thomas recalled. But the way he talked about it, the excitement in his eyes when he described his experiments, it was disturbing. More importantly, Thomas revealed that Vincent had maintained contact with one family member throughout the years. His sister Margaret, who had died in 2018 at the age of... Margaret had been a retired nurse who had lived in a small town in Northern California, and according to Thomas, she had been receiving regular visits from Vincent as recently as the early 2000s. Walsh immediately traveled to California to investigate this lead. Margaret Marlowe's former neighbors in the town of Willows remembered her as a quiet, private woman who had lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Several neighbors recalled seeing an elderly man visiting Margaret regularly, someone they had assumed was a family member or friend. The visits had continued for years, always brief and always conducted with unusual secrecy. Margaret's house had been sold after her death, but the new owners had discovered something interesting during renovations. Hidden in the basement behind a false wall was a small room containing medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and detailed medical records dating back to the records showed that Margaret had been providing nursing care to someone who required ongoing medical treatment, someone who had been living in secret for decades. The medical records were written in the same precise handwriting that Walsh had seen in Marlowe's laboratory notes. They documented treatments for various age-related conditions, medications for chronic illnesses, and most tellingly, procedures for maintaining cognitive function in an aging brain. It appeared that Marlowe had been living in hiding with his sister's help, continuing his research on himself as he aged. But the records ended abruptly in 2017, a year before Margaret's death. The final entry described Marlowe's deteriorating health and his decision to finalize Phase 4 of the research. There was a reference to a location called the Last Station, but no specific address or coordinates were provided. The search for the last station led Walsh's team back to the Nevada desert, where satellite imaging had revealed an anomaly in the landscape about 60 miles from the original burial site. Enhanced imagery showed what appeared to be a small structure built into the side of a remote canyon, almost invisible from ground level but detectable from above due to unusual thermal signatures. The journey to the canyon required a helicopter and specialized climbing equipment. Walsh's team rappelled down the canyon wall on a freezing December morning, their breath visible in the thin desert air. What they found at the bottom of the canyon was Vincent Marlowe's final laboratory, a sophisticated facility carved directly into the rock face, powered by solar panels and geothermal energy. Unlike his previous facilities, this one had never been abandoned. Inside, Walsh found evidence that Marlowe had continued his research until very recently. The laboratory contained advanced medical equipment, computer systems with detailed databases of his experiments, and most significantly, a comprehensive record of every person he had killed over the course of 40 years. The database was meticulous in its detail, containing photographs, biographical information, and detailed records of the procedures conducted on each victim. The total number of victims was staggering: 47 couples and 23 individual subjects, spanning from 97. David and Linda Hartwell were listed as subjects 15 and 16, their entries containing photographs and notes that documented their captivity and eventual deaths with clinical detachment. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was in the final section of the laboratory. Walsh found what appeared to be a hospital room, complete with life support equipment and monitoring devices. In the center of the room was an adjustable bed containing the mummified remains of an elderly man. Beside the bed was a note written in the same precise handwriting Walsh had seen throughout the investigation. Final experiment concluded. Subject expired naturally at 11:47 p.m., October 31. Total research span, 48 years, 7 months, 12 days. Data preserved for future analysis. VM. Vincent Marlowe had died alone in his hidden laboratory, less than 2 months before Walsh's team discovered his location. He had continued his twisted research until the very end, documenting even his own death with the same clinical detachment he had shown toward his victims. But his death had not come soon enough to prevent decades of suffering, and it provided little comfort to the families who had been waiting for answers since. The computer database contained contact information for some of the victims' relatives, and Walsh spent the following months making the most difficult phone calls of her career. For many families, the discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief: relief at finally knowing what had happened to their loved ones, but profound sadness at learning the details of their suffering. Michael Hartwell, David's younger brother, was among the first to be notified. Now 71 years old and living in retirement in San Diego, Michael had never stopped believing that someday he would learn the truth about his brother's disappearance. "I always knew something terrible had happened to them," he told Walsh during their phone conversation. "But knowing is both better and worse than wondering. At least now I can finally say goodbye." The investigation officially concluded in March 2025, with the publication of a comprehensive report that detailed Marlowe's crimes and their impact on dozens of families across the American West. The report recommended changes to missing persons protocols and cross-jurisdictional communication to prevent similar cases from going undetected in the future. But for Walsh, the conclusion of the investigation brought little satisfaction. Standing once again in the Nevada desert where it all began, She reflected on the decades of suffering that could have been prevented if investigators in the 1980s had recognized the patterns that were hiding in plain sight. The vastness of the American West had provided perfect cover for a predator who understood how to exploit the isolation and limited communication of rural law enforcement agencies. The Sunset Vista Motel had been demolished years earlier, its neon sign long since extinguished. But the memory of Room 17 and what happened there would live on in the case files and the hearts of those who had been touched by this tragedy. The desert had finally given up its secrets, but it had taken 43 years and advances in technology that couldn't have been imagined when David and Linda Hartwell first checked into that lonely motel. As Walsh drove away from the site where the investigation had begun, she couldn't shake the feeling that other secrets lay buried in the vast expanses of the American West, waiting for the right combination of technology, determination, and luck to bring them to light. The Hartwell case had been solved, but it had also revealed how much darkness could hide in the empty spaces between small towns and forgotten highways. The families of Marlowe's victims would finally have closure, and the man responsible for their loved ones' deaths would face justice in the court of history, if not in a courtroom. But the investigation had also served as a sobering reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, hiding behind credentials and professional facades while conducting unspeakable acts in the shadows. In the end, the story of David and Linda Hartwell was both unique and tragically common, a tale of innocence destroyed by someone who had convinced himself that his victims were merely subjects in a greater scientific endeavor. Their brief stop at a roadside motel had ended in horror, but their memory would live on as a reminder that every missing person represents a life cut short, a family left wondering, and a mystery that deserves to be solved no matter how much time has passed. The desert keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, if we are persistent enough and lucky enough, it gives them back. For David and Linda Hartwell, that persistence had finally paid off, bringing them home after more than 4 decades in the darkness. Their journey was over at last, but their story would continue to serve as both a warning and a testament to the power of never giving up hope that the truth will eventually emerge from even the deepest shadows. The Nevada wind continues to blow across the empty landscape, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the promise that no secret, no matter how well hidden, can remain buried forever.